Hello and welcome to this Just Festival platform event. Please do settle back, pour yourself a wee dram and enjoy the discussion this evening, which is entitled A Dram Disgrace. Now, this event is a question about how to develop a more inclusive whisky industry. So you'll be able to pose your questions or your suggestions and comments to the panel via the Zoom Q&A facility. So please do familiarise yourself with that. And there'll be time at the end of the panel discussion to take as many of those questions as possible. We don't have a chat facility this evening, so that's your only way of getting in touch with us. So do please note this evening's session is being recorded. So if you do want to ask a question, you may want to ask that question anonymously if you prefer. If not, that's we're perfectly, and it's very nice to know your name. Just select from the drop-down tab at the top of the text box when you're trying to switch it to anonymous. So our chair this evening is Helen Ford, who is CEO of LA Global Strategic Communications Agency, and she is also a member of the Just Festival board. Helen was particularly keen to chair this event because it combined two things very close to her heart: whisky and social justice. And I'm going to hand you over to Helen now, who will introduce the rest of the panel, and I'm looking forward to a lovely discussion. Thank you now.
Thank you, Helen. Welcome, everyone. So whisky has long had masculine associations, but for some time now, women have been drinking and making it in ever-growing numbers. According to the market research firm Kantar, women in the UK now drink 40 million more glasses of whisky every year than they did in 2010. That's a rise of 15% compared with a decline of 6% amongst men. And there are even more women distillers, warehouse managers, master blenders, whisky shop owners, whisky club organisers, whisky writers and journalists, as well as plenty of women sales managers and PR managers than ever before. Yet this year, one of whisky's best-known writers and critics was called out for sexism in his writing and, perhaps justifiably, has stated that as they were his personal opinions, provided in a relevant context, he's entitled to express those opinions in whatever way he wishes. Nevertheless, across the industry, brands have now spoken out, demonstrating their support for a campaign to clean up the language used across all whisky writing. In this panel event, we're going to talk to some of those in the industry to understand their experiences, as well as discussing the things that might need to change. Has recent online coverage sparked a much needed discussion about inclusivity and language? Or has it just created a storm in a teacup that misrepresents the industry? In short, is there really a problem with sexism and gender bias in the whisky industry that needs to be tackled? And if so, how? I'd like to introduce tonight's panelists. Irini Georgioglu is the UK's MasterChef champion 2019. Born on the island of Crete, Irini grew up in Athens, where she and her brothers were educated. In 1980, Irini moved to London, where she enjoyed a banking career in the city for over 30 years. Irini and her husband John have made over 40 visits to whisky distilleries, attended a weekly whisky school, and love spending time on Islay and Speyside during their whisky festivals. Steph Murray is a founding member of the Shawfern Group, a family organisation that operates a growing collection of boutique hotels, such as the Downs Hotel and Hotel 1881 in Speyside. Her knowledge of and passion for whisky were solidified by her attendance at the Spirit of Speyside Whisky School in 2014. And coincidentally, in 2018, that's where Irini and I met. She continues to make it of pivotal importance to the business via regular events, whisky-paired meals, and continued marketing of the still, the Downs Whisky Snug, as a destination of choice. Prior to making hospitality her chosen career, Steph pursued a postgraduate degree in human rights and international politics from Glasgow University. Ian Miller joined the family distillers William Grant & Sons in 1998 as distilleries manager for the company's flagship Glenfiddich and Balvenie single malt Scotch whisky distilleries. He's also been distillery manager at the Bladnoch, Mortlach, Blair Athol, Dalwhinnie, Linkwood and Glen Elgin distilleries before joining William Grant & Sons to manage their malt distilleries. In 2019, Ian was invited to join the Keepers of the Quake Society as a Master of the Quake. And in 2016, Ian was inducted into the Icons of Whisky Hall of Fame. Megan Murdock has over 25 years in the drinks industry. She has a degree in viticulture and enology, as well as a general certificate in distilling with the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, concentrating on the production of whisky. She's currently the head distilling and operations head of distilling and operations at Glenfiddich Distillery in Speyside, following a long career around the world, ranging from making sake in Japan through to working in retail, import, export, and buying. She has also sat on the highly esteemed IWSC and IWC judging panels. And last but by no means least, Becky Paskin is a UK-based spirits journalist, whiskey specialist and consultant who's been writing about drinks for over 12 years. Most recently, she was editor of leading online magazine ScotchWhisky.com and global trade title The Spirits Business. She became the first journalist to gain a general certificate in distillation with the IBD, a qualification usually reserved for distillery operators. And she's a judge for the IWSC and a member of Exclusive Society Keepers of the Quake. She was also named 2020 Icons of Whiskey Communicator of the Year and listed in About Time magazine's Top 10 Women to Watch in Drinks 2020. Now, anyone that drinks whiskey will know that you never start a conversation without having a dram in hand. And I've asked each of the panelists to bring along a dram of something that is made by or represents a story of women in whiskey. What have you picked and why? Irene, what are you drinking tonight?
I have a sweet tooth, Helen, so I'm drinking a Penderyn from Wales. Apologies to everybody in Scotland, but I thought I would go off-piste a bit. And it's matured in Madeira cask. So it's wonderful, great nose. It's got all the things that I love, you know, custard and biscuits and spices, vanilla. So, yeah.
And a female production team.
Absolutely. For me, that was of relevance. I followed them from the beginning. And what I love is the ethos and culture in not actually just picking women, but picking the best people for the job. And if they happen to be women, great. So I think that is probably a more balanced approach that suits me.
Great. Ian, what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking Balvenie, the sweet toast of American oak, 12-year-old. And the reason I'm drinking that is it was created by our to-be Balvenie malt master, Kelsey McKechnie, who's a young lady who's bursting through and who will take over the reins of the Balvenie brand from David Stewart. So it's a neat little 12-year-old. It's had an extra toast out in the States to bring out additional sweetness, and it's doing extremely well, and it goes down extremely well. Slange.
Excellent. Megan, what have you got tonight?
Well, I was meant to have Glendronach 12-year-old, but I am drinking Speyside's best water this evening.
Well, that's fair enough, given that you're already a woman making great strides in whiskey production as well. So it makes sense to start with what you start with.
Exactly.
Steph, what have you got there? You're muted, Steph.
Sorry. So I've got Balvenie 14-year-old Caribbean cask, one of my ultimate favourites. And obviously just one of the whiskies that's created by a brand that strongly supports female role models. Obviously, as Ian mentioned earlier, Kelsey McKechnie is up-and-coming malt master distiller, which is brilliant. Great to support those kinds of roles that women are stepping into and stepping up for, which is brilliant.
And Becky, all the way down on the south coast, aren't you? What are you drinking tonight?
Yeah, I'm down in Brighton, sadly not up in Speyside with everyone else. And also Balvenie is a great one, both of you to choose that as well, because their global brand ambassador is, of course, Gemma Patterson. And yep. She's doing a great job in spreading the word of whiskey around the world. But tonight I'm on Macmira Grunt Tea. Sorry, I'm going off piste with a Swedish whiskey, completely off piste. This is made by a distiller called Angela Durazio. And for me, she's probably one of the most innovative whiskey makers in the world right now. I think her creativity knows no bounds. So this is a whiskey that's been part matured in a cask seasoned with green tea, which is interesting. Makes for a nice herbal, fresh experience in the whiskey.
Great. Well, I'm going actually with something slightly different because, well, two things. First of all, you lot picked some really good ones. So counted me out of some of those that I would. I'm actually drinking Highland Park 12, which might seem like a bit of a weird one, but I wanted to drink something that referenced the fact that it's not just now that women have been doing quite interesting things in whiskey. And it also sort of plays in with my love of sort of stories about exciting and interesting women. In the 40s, the Robertson sisters inherited the whiskey business from their grandfather and father. And eventually this became the Edrington Group, which owns Highland Park and Famous Grouse and the McCann, amongst others. And I particularly like Ethel because she had this love of fast cars and was one of the first people to install a speed camera detector in her car. And speaking as someone that spends quite a lot of time driving up and down the A1 and A9, that struck me as a particular strand of genius, which I think has been applied throughout the whiskey production as well. The fact that it's on special offer in Asda at the moment was also a win in my book. But let's move on. Welcome everyone. Anyhow, let's move on to some questions. So, Becky, back in interviews in September, you said that the whole industry has been striving towards gender diversity, not just Scotch, but everyone, striving towards gender, race diversity and equality for so long. And it's a discussion about stamping out sexism in whiskey. And you said that the reason this has blown up as big as it has is because so many people have now come out with their own stories and identified some of the things that have been said, or identified with some of the things that have been said. Now, if we accept that feminism is about addressing the structures that create social, financial, and economic inequality for women, what is your personal experience of sexism in whiskey? I'd actually like to start with Megan on this one, speaking as a woman working in whiskey. And I'm really keen to focus on the global issue. We're not now talking about anything that's happened with any one publication or anything like that. I'm interested about the industry as a whole, Megan.
Well, I've worked in obviously beer, sake, wine, and now spirits. But I think that it's trying to understand what is sexism and what is gender bias. And I've been having lots of conversations leading up to this to try and get that concept. So I suppose it's just trying to identify, first of all, what people think is sexism in the industry, or sexism in general, versus gender bias. Like, what would you say is sexism?
Well, Becky, I mean, given that you're the person that sort of started the quote at the beginning of this question, do you think we should be talking about sexism, or should we be talking about gender bias?
I think it's both, quite honestly. I think every woman in the industry has their own story to tell and their own individual experience. And I think just to sweep across and say it's just gender bias or it's just sexism is doing the whole issue a disservice, to be honest. In the last couple of months, I've been messaged by hundreds of women around the world telling me their different stories of the way that they've been treated in the line of work, or even when they're just ordering a whiskey in a bar, if they're just a consumer, and the behavior and the attitude towards them. And it really does swing all the way from the unconscious bias of assuming that women don't work in whiskey or even drink it, all the way through to sexual harassment in the line of work while leading whiskey tastings. And I think you're right to ask the question, well, where does that actually stem from? Because it is systemic, and it is an issue that was unfortunately created by the whiskey industry. Now, I think the whiskey industry has realised that there is an issue, and it's already moving beyond some of the behaviours of the past, and it's doing a really good job to change attitudes. But I still think that there's a really long way to go, which is why we're still having this discussion now, because there has been such a reaction to some of the comments that have been made in the past couple of months.
Steph, you're in the industry up in Speyside. What are your experience of it? And do you feel that we should be talking more about sexism or gender bias?
I actually agree that it's both that we should be talking about, in all honesty. And I think that, totally in agreement with you, Becky, that there have been, creations within the whiskey industry itself. But I also think that the whiskey industry isn't an island, and it sits within a wider context of society and culture generally. So I think that sexism and gender bias unfortunately still exist pretty much in any industry. So I think that it can't be seen as a separate entity in and of itself. So I think it's linked in, although there are definitely, you know, key points within the whisky industry, you know, that perpetuate sexism and gender bias as well. And those are the things that need to be overcome. For myself personally, I've experienced many different examples of both sexism and gender bias. I mean, obviously I'm an owner of a hotel. The still, which is Our Whisky Snug, was populated in terms of bottles by myself. And that is met with both shock and disbelief sometimes by general consumers, because it just is deemed as being a bit out there that a woman was capable of doing that, which is quite sad. Now, that's obviously not the case in every instance, and it's obviously deemed to be very positive as well. But that's the lesser element of what I've experienced. Sometimes it's gone right through till, you know, harassment, as Becky was saying as well. And I think that's very sad that it exists and continues to exist. But I think it sits in a wider context as well.
Irini, you've obviously come from a background in banking, and now you're working in the food industry, both of which could be described as fairly male-dominated and dominating environments. What have you noticed about the parallels with your experiences of whisky?
Well, obviously, I'm not in the industry, so I can't talk so much about gender bias, although I assume that when it comes to selecting somebody, particularly in specific roles like managerial, I suspect that gender bias exists. Stereotyping, I find, is more widely prevalent, particularly my experience of that is more as a woman consumer. But with regard to specific role stereotyping, perhaps that too, because we understand that there are women in distilling and blending, but do we consider them, does the whiskey industry consider them suitable for all positions or all roles? I'm not so sure. In banking, there are great strides being made. It is recognized that there is an issue. It has been recognized for a very long time. And there are some players who are ahead of the curve. I believe the same happens in all industries. And it's lovely to see their examples. But just by the fact that we tonight are talking about it, I think progress is being made in the whiskey industry as well. But certainly both those things, I think, apply, whether it's in-house, in the industry itself, or the way consumers are seen by the industry.
Well, we're going to come on to talking about marketing and the consumer side of things in a little while. But before we do that, I'd like to talk about the production of whisky. Laura Davis, the head distiller at Penderyn, actually, the whisky that you're drinking, Irini, said that nowadays the scene is completely different. We have a lot more females in the technical and frontline roles. A lot more distilleries have got those females as the figureheads of their businesses, not because they're nice to look at, but because they know their stuff. Ian, from a male perspective, is there a noticeable difference between men and women in the workplace?
In managerial positions, I actually find that women are better at the detail, are more organized, and in general come to a meeting better prepared than men. And it's almost like they feel that they have to go the extra mile in order to, I guess, feel that they're equal at the table. So I find that women are actually better prepared, more detailed, and better managers. They have empathy where men simply don't. But going back to something that we were talking about earlier on, I think in my company, if there's at the recruiting process, if you've got a strong influence from women who are involved in the recruiting process, then you're always going to see more women coming through and getting a fairer chance. Now, I'm trying to be honest about what's happening certainly in the whisky industry right now, there are more women coming into the recruiting process in HR, and therefore I think more better chance of coming through, an equal chance of coming through as men have. It's all about what you can deliver and what you can to the company. It's your value, and that value is allowed better to come through when the HR has a reasonable presence of women.
Okay. Now, one of the things I'm interested in, Megan, you've worked both here and in Japan in production, and there has been a fair amount of coverage talking about how this is less of a problem in other whiskey producing countries than, or less of a discussion in other whiskey producing countries than it is currently over here. And that is primarily influenced by there being an absence of male focused advertising. Is that something you would agree with or disagree with? And what are your experiences as a woman in whiskey production?
Well, I mean, I'm not making whiskey up here, but I was down in London. And when I was in Japan, I was making sake. But out there, the culture's very, very different. But I'm also a white woman. I'm not a Japanese woman. But I had no issues working there. I didn't have any of the experiences there that I've had in Canada, in England, France. These are all places where I've had similar, again, sexism and gender bias. But Japan for me was the easiest place to work for that kind of thing.
And why do you think that was? What's different here and there?
Here, well, I think the culture is different there. So it's very, you wouldn't do things and say things, the language won't allow you to say some of the things or do some of the things that you would do. Now, maybe that's different, again, because I'm not a Japanese woman. So I don't know what life would have been like as a Japanese woman. But the sake brewery that I worked for had they hired a female brewer, and that was in 2005. So that's quite a long time ago now. And yeah, I think, because I've been in the industry quite a long time, and I have seen, now things are so different, but there's still, like Becky said, and like Steph said, we're still, people will still walk into the distillery and walk up. There'll be two of us. One of us will be me and the other one's a man, and they will walk up to them, just making the assumption that they're the person that's running the place. So yeah, I don't know why. Maybe it is partly cultural. It's you have wine, whiskey, and beer are all areas that have been predominantly male-dominated areas for production and everything else. But I came up to Speyside. I've met probably 15 women up here who worked in the whiskey industry for over 30 years. I've never heard their names until now.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So.
Ian, you mentioned about women being better at some things than men, or certainly approaching things differently. Do women bring natural skills that men don't have as easily within the whiskey world? I'm thinking, for example, sense of taste and smell and things like that.
Yes, I think one of the first tasters was Maureen Robinson, who for a very long time was one of the main tasters behind Diageo's brands, all their single malts. So I think it's really the last 10 years that Maureen's become more known, and that's who people like other people in the whiskey industry actually bring her to the fore. But she was one of probably the first women that really we'd started talking about as almost like a whiskey celebrity. So I got to know Maureen when I was with Diageo about 25 years. And she's a lovely lady, but there's a greater sense of smell within females. Saying that, we have a nosing panel where I work at the distillery, and the ladies seem to do better than men at picking out the different nuances of smell.
So if we take all of that into account, and the fact that there seems to be a feeling that women bring different things that are of benefit, and actually there is an increasing number of women in whiskey. Becky, you've talked in a number of the interviews that you've given about, you've described the fact that people are suddenly talking vocally about sexism and gender bias, sharing their own experiences. You've described that as Whisky's Me Too movement, in the sense that it's responding to that social media fury. Do we think Whisky needs a Me Too movement? Becky?
Well, yes, because quite honestly, I've been talking about this subject for years, and I know there are some who think that I've only just started talking about it now because apparently I have a book coming out, which I don't, by the way. It needed this to happen for this current discussion to take place. We wouldn't be talking about this now if it wasn't for everybody else raising their hand and going, hey, I've experienced this too in the line of work. And, I've not published or not publicly shown all of the comments that were sent to me. It was a really heavy couple of weeks when I received all these messages from women all over the world, and we're talking young women who have just gotten started in the industry, all the way up to the most established and famous blenders and distillers in the industry, our colleagues. And each one of them was telling me a story of how they've experienced some form of gender bias or sexism, either while they've been working or while they're at the bar ordering drinks. And it was a really heavy experience to be the only one really to see all of that. And I don't feel like I need to publish all of it. I'm hoping that people believe just how widespread and endemic this issue is, because it is widespread. So did we need a Me Too movement? Yeah, absolutely, because we wouldn't be talking about it now otherwise, and we need to talk about it. And I'm so proud of the industry for the way it's responded, and I'm proud of people like yourself bringing this discussion to the forefront, because it needs to be had if we're going to really encourage the next generation of women to come into the industry, to feel comfortable working in the industry, and for women to feel confident and comfortable ordering a whiskey at a bar without having a raised eyebrow or being asked if they even like it, or would they like water or Coke with that.
Mm-hmm. So with that in mind then, do you think that we should be engaging in positive discrimination to promote and develop the number of women in the industry, or establishing an all guys together approach? I mean, what's needed? Perhaps if you start, Becky, and then Steph, I'd be interested to hear your views on that as well.
Sure, it's an interesting one, and I think one that brands at least have really struggled with what's the right approach here. And I think, at least on a consumer level, things like women in whiskey groups are important to initially give women a safe space to be able to talk about whiskey and to taste whiskey, where they're not going to be spoken over, they're not going to be harassed, that it's easy for them, and they feel like they're surrounded by like-minded people who they can connect with too. I think on a brand level, when it comes to marketing, it does need to be a let's show everybody drinking whiskey together. Women need to be portrayed drinking whiskey alongside men. That's how you normalize it. You just show everybody together on equal footing, and there are some brands doing an amazing job of that already. I think that's probably the way forward. But if you're going to have a marketing campaign, say with you have a famous male brand ambassador, that's fine. Or maybe your next campaign you have a famous female brand ambassador. I feel like having men and women alongside each other in campaigns will help normalize the fact that this is a drink for anybody to enjoy, rather than just one or the other. And just while we're talking about equal representation, people of colour need to be seen in whiskey adverts as well, particularly in the UK.
Steph, I mean, taking that point and moving it on, one person that we spoke to in preparation for this said that the only gender bias they've actually really experienced in whiskey has been in its advertising and the way it's been marketed, and that there's a real short-sightedness there. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what Becky was saying, is that there are definitely some brands that are doing the gig of marketing better than others. I think, sorry, just kind of linking back into the things that need to change, is that there's still a bit of a sense of whiskey being discussed within a kind of an old boys club type sense. And I think that if you don't have female presence within that to kind of break that apart, then you're not going to change the conversation and you're not going to get more women involved. I mean, I've been on the receiving end of, you know, groups of men that work within the industry who separately would probably all be very supportive of their female colleagues, but grouped together in an all boys club that have been drinking for, you know, 3 or 4 hours, suddenly become this homogenous group of, you know, anti-women, because you can't possibly know anything about whiskey because you don't drink it, type mentality. And that just needs to stop. So for it to move forward. So I think that you need to have female presence within those kinds of, you know, meetings, whether that's marketing meetings, whether that's directorial meetings, you know, whatever it happens to be, HR, like Ian was saying earlier, you know, getting more women into these rooms to have these kinds of conversations. So I don't think it's, yes, marketing has its issues, but I don't think it's just marketing that has its issues. I think every element of the whiskey industry needs to have more female presence, less male dominance. And that's not taking away from the role that men play within the industry, because they're just as important, but men need to be part of that conversation as well in order to change it, I think.
If I can just add as well onto that, really good points by Steph. But another part of this as well is the role that the media has to play in the portrayal of whiskey as a drink as well. Too many times it's portrayed as a drink for Father's Day or gifted by him for Christmas, and it's never even thought of as something for women or for Mother's Day. And I feel like brands and PR companies also have that responsibility to ensure the message that comes across, even when they're promoting their whiskey, promote it around Mother's Day, promote it as a drink for her, promote it to female magazines. Why does it always have to be in the GQs of the world? I think, yeah, the media also has that responsibility too.
It's interesting now. In one of my experiences, I'll come back to you in a moment,
Yeah,
Steph.
sorry.
I want to pick up on that point actually, because certainly my experience of talking to men in the industry is that if you ask them about production and things like that, they'll give you lots of wonderful examples of women working in whiskey. And then if you ask, you know, men working in whiskey up in Scotland about marketing and PR teams, you get a wholly more colourful response. Do you think the problem does lie, Ian, with the marketing departments rather than the production teams?
Well, they have a role to play in how it's portrayed outwardly. And if we are identifying only men, then clearly that's wrong. It's better to identify simply the whiskey lover rather than a man or a woman per se. So they have a role to play. There's no doubt about it. And I'm pretty sure that in this, what's happened over the last 3-4 months, I'm pretty sure that marketing teams will start to think in a different way in terms of how they portray the brands outwardly, so that it is more inclusive rather than just towards men. So I have a role to play. I'm hoping that they will adjust to the point where it is inclusive.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking in the bit at the beginning about the role of women in the marketing and the communications. Before we came online, we were talking about how women are portrayed when they are drinking whiskey in adverts, and I think it's interesting. Steph and Irini, both of you spend quite a lot of time engaging with whiskey on a tourism level, and it's one person that we spoke to said that they get a lot of feedback that people don't want to be lectured by a young female about whiskey. You know, they're always asking for someone more senior or male for a bit of credibility. But on the flip side, she said, you know, at 41, she's been also told that she's past her prime and she's too old. So she's drawn the conclusion that you have to be a 23-year-old with a good wiggle to actually sell whiskey. So does that mean you think that distilleries, as a tourist or someone involved in, let's start with Steph and then move on to Irini for your experience of this. You know, do you think that that whiskey distilleries and the whiskey industry is employing women in marketing roles for the wrong reasons?
I mean, I'm not sure I can comment directly on that, because obviously of not necessarily working directly with any kind of marketing team or anything like that. But my experience of being up in the area is that some of the times that we've tried to work within the context of promoting equality and diversity ourselves, whenever we're putting events forward or things like that, there's been a bit of backlash from some of the bigger brands about including men in those conversations. So it becomes about, if you're doing a women in whiskey event, the women in whiskey event has to be women only, and that's the only way that you'll get support, which seems illogical to me, because from a background of working within the context of things like rape crisis, men have to be part of any kind of conversation that relates to change. So marketing, from my perspective, not obviously working directly with the teams, it's difficult to say, but as a consumer of marketing, I think that there just isn't enough conversation going on about broadening the conversation and having a conversation that involves all types of whiskey drinkers, like Ian was saying, rather than it being, knuckled down to a man of colour or a woman of colour. Anybody drinks whiskey, and it doesn't matter what they look like, who they are, everybody loves it, and that's the story that we should be selling to the consumer.
Irini, what do you think?
Well, as a consumer, as a visitor, as a participant from the outside, I must say that what has frustrated me from time to time has been lack of knowledge or experience, and really not at all anything to do with age or gender. And particularly you see that at times of festivals where people are brought in last minute and they perhaps don't know as much as I would like to hear. But there must be a disconnect. I think there is a disconnect between production and marketing. So perhaps the need is there for better internal communication and external when the industry engages external marketeers. But I remember from my own experience in banking, anybody that I engaged to promote my image and my product, they had to follow my brief, my ethos, understand where I was coming from before taking what I produced to the world. So perhaps this is something for the management teams of distilleries to sit and look at. How clearly do they pass the message to the marketing departments or marketing partners as to how they really stand on the issue of gender equality?
Becky, you were waving at me earlier. Did you want to add something to that? Or were you just waving at me to say hello? No, that's fine. You can just wave at me to say hello. It's nice to feel loved and welcome. That's fine. So one of the things we talked about as well at the beginning was the use of imagery of young women. And I do think that particularly as we look at advertising and writing particularly, is there perhaps some disconnect in the way whiskey writing talks about women and the sorts of women that are represented in marketing and the way women are represented in marketing. I'm thinking, for example, who are we trying to appeal to? Are we putting younger women into whiskey marketing because we're actually still trying to appeal to the same men, but just they're slightly younger? Or are we trying to masculinize women at marketing, whiskey marketing? Becky, what's your view? I know you were commenting before we started about a new advert that's come out.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one for some brands whose traditional target demographic has been the men. But as you pointed out earlier on, more and more women are drinking whiskey than ever before. So currently it's around 35% of whiskey drinkers are now women. So if you're not marketing towards that demographic as well as your male demographic, then you're just cutting out a huge segment of the market, and it makes just no business sense to be doing that. It's just like if you are a marketer for cleaning products, for instance, why would you solely be marketing your cleaning products to women when men also have, they also clean? Well, I hope they do. So it's kind of a job to, I feel that brands should be marketing towards women as well as men. Sorry, I'm rambling and I've forgotten your question.
No, I'm interested to try and explore a little more some of the disconnects, because
right. So
there's
yeah,
no denying that there are more younger women being portrayed in whiskey advertising. But what I'm wondering is whether or not that's just because we're trying to attract more men to it. You know, it's.
Well, I think for the most part, those brands that are include women within their marketing are doing so in a way where both men and women are represented equally. And there are some brands doing a brilliant job of that. There's probably just, and I could probably only count them on one hand nowadays, certainly maybe 5-10 years ago, it was a little bit different. In wider global marketing campaigns, there are very few that just have one woman at the center of their campaign, probably just for the sake of attracting a more male audience. So it'll be a really hot celebrity woman, and you have to consider who are you targeting this towards. But I do think nowadays things are starting to change, and I think brands are waking up to the fact that there is a huge market out there for of women who want to drink your whiskey, and who may be interested in whiskey, but just don't feel like it's a product for them, because it has traditionally and still is being marketed just towards men. The way that translates into the media is that's obviously set a tone. So if I were, you know, some young reporter on a desk at a newspaper, and I'm writing about a gift guide for whiskies, I'd be writing about single malts from the perspective of like, oh, this is a gentleman's drink, and this should be like on every father's wish list, and this is for reclining in your other armchair drinking a dram. Now, you wouldn't know any different. Why would you know any different? All you're writing about is you're basing your writing on the perception that you've been fed by the industry and historical marketing. So the only way that is going to change is by the industry itself changing through marketing, yes, but also through the direct education from brand to PR company to media. So I've said this before, but it's everybody's duty within the industry to change the discussion, to move this forward, because without everybody working together, it's not going to get anywhere, and we're still going to be stuck in the same place.
So I have a question concerning that then, in that the role of the critic is quite often a self-appointed critic, but it has huge influence, whomever they are. And whilst there are a number of positive female role models in that whiskey writing industry, it's fair to say that women have a harder time obtaining the standing and respect than some of the more traditional established male writers have. Why do we think this is?
Probably because the big names in whiskey have been at it for longer, quite honestly. Okay. There are a few big male names in whiskey that have written books that have amazing knowledge, whose tasting notes are quite frankly poetic and beautiful. So they've got great careers behind them. They've quite rightly so should be big names. It's only now really that there are more women looking at writing about whiskey as a career who are coming forward and starting to make names for themselves. People like Alice Lascelles, for instance, who writes for the Financial Times, and she's fantastic. She's doing a great job of really representing female writers in whiskey. And there are some younger women coming through as well. Many of who, or a few that I've mentored myself as editor too. So I feel like it's a timing thing rather than a women struggling to make their names known thing. I mean, just last week I was named IWSC Spirit Communicator of the Year, and that's something that no woman in whiskey has ever had before. Now, hopefully, I won't be, in the words of Kamala Harris, I might be the first, but I certainly won't be the last, and there'll be a lot more women coming through doing that too.
Yeah.
Irene, you're just you're in this world at the moment with books and all sorts of things coming out almost every day, it feels like at the minute. How do you think, going on from this, male or female, the language and imagery traditionally used to evoke the taste and flavour might become more progressive? Because it's something that whiskey has struggled with, but that food reviewing, I suppose one could argue, has also struggled with over the years.
Yes, I think language actually has been an issue in every industry. Again, talking about banking, you know, a recent report in 2020 showed that $700 billion are used in revenues because banks haven't found a way to communicate and target the specific needs of female customers. So actually, whiskey, I'm sorry to say, ladies, you are in it. And to you, it's your world every day. It matters, but actually we experience it in life everywhere. Interestingly, I have to say that very young people are not noticing it because they are not thinking like that. So I asked my stepson, who is 32, for example, do you feel that you are excluded in the targeting of food advertising or, you know, any kind of consumer goods? And he said, no. I would say, you know, his first reaction was, no, I think 90% of the advertisements I see are not gender targeting. And even with whiskey, which, you know, he loves and he participates in this passion of ours, he doesn't pick up on that because he doesn't think like that. I think younger people are purer, and my step-grandchildren will not understand even this conversation if they happen to see it in 20 years' time. So it's a matter of, I'm afraid, everything has to be a matter of education. And I agree with what Becky was saying. It is changing. People ask you to write because engaging writing and passionate writing comes from experience. So the more women learn and grow within the industry, the more they can command, you know, the interest of the consumers. So I think that will definitely change. It's changing already, as we see. But at the moment, it happens across the world, I would think.
One of the things that was very interesting to me is that actually when we were doing the research for this, there are a lot of interviews with women in whiskey, in quotes. But what has been particularly interesting is when you start looking at, Megan, I'd like to talk to you about this, when you start looking at women in production who have been interviewed about their work. If you take, for example, Rachel Barry, who's arguably one of the best known women working in the whiskey industry at the moment, you read a number of interviews, but they don't actually say anything particularly interesting, or they don't say anything that particularly positions her as doing the interesting things that those that know her know she's doing. And I wonder if that there is an issue. If you look at some of the great artists, they've required a really excellent interviewer to draw out of them what it is they're trying to achieve, because the artist doesn't know for themselves. And I think that there may be, is it fair to say, a lack of people understanding the questions, the pertinent questions to ask women in the industry to actually highlight the fantastic stuff that's going on. Megan, do you think that it's right? Do you think that's correct? What questions do you think we should be asking women in the industry?
It's a good question. I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, it's just, I mean, I've had a number of interviews over the years. And like I had mentioned to you, like I had not heard of Rachel Berry until I actually moved up here. And that to me, like, is a crime because, you know, she's been in the industry forever. But I'm not sure what sort of questions would be good to bring that sort of thing out.
I mean, Becky, this is your work. Sorry, Steph, go for it.
No, all I was going to say was that I think that if we ask the question about what women specifically should be getting asked, I guess that's where the issue lies, because actually we should be asking the exact same questions to women that work in the industry as we do to the men that work in the industry. And I think that that's a way of breaking down those barriers of lack of equality, is the sense that we have to ask them a different question because there are women working in the industry. Whereas if we stop treating them like they're different, then we'll start to normalize it. Like, you know, Becky talked about normalization earlier, and I think that that's really important. There just has to be a normalization of who these people are. They work in the industry, so that's their passion, that's why they do it. So ask them about their job, ask them about their passion. Don't ask them, you know, what it's like to be a woman in the industry. You know what I mean? I mean, that's an important question to ask as well sometimes, but it doesn't have to be the only question that's asked when you're talking to a woman in the industry.
But that's, I think, the interviews that I've had over the years, like mostly that I am being asked those questions. So I wouldn't say that that's where I've been discriminated against, for sure. There's many, many other ways though.
Steph, you're totally spot on with what questions should we be asking women who make whiskey. Exactly the same questions as you'd ask a guy who's making whiskey. There's no difference in their ability to do their job whatsoever. When I was editor of ScotchWhisky.com, I had quite often contributors would send me a pitch for an article to say, I really want to interview this woman whiskey distiller because she's just been named first woman to do this, or she's just been named Women in Whiskey of the Year or something. I'm like, no, if you want to interview her because she's interesting, or she's done something that's interesting. Her gender's got nothing to do with it. And I'd swear, if any of you ask the question, what's it like to be a woman in whiskey, I'm going to cut it from your article, because that's not what we're here to do. We're here to talk about the whiskey itself and their skill as a distiller or blender. We're not here to talk about their gender. And the way to really normalize the fact that women are working in the industry is to stop calling them out as something like unicorns, because they're not. There are so many women who are making whiskey. We need to normalize it. So, I have to say, I haven't seen articles outside of maybe the really simple consumer press, where maybe the journalists don't know anything about whiskey in the first place anyway, and it's potentially an article that's maybe been placed by the brand on an advertising level, that's really failed to ask the right questions of women, but ask them correctly of men. So, I mean, if you go to any whiskey publication or any distilling publication with like a special interest, I think men and women are treated very similarly. I think it would depend on the article and the publication, and you have to call into question, well, who's the journalist that's written it? Do they actually know anything about whiskey to ask those in-depth questions in the first place? So I think there's probably more to it than just a simple, this is a gender issue.
So, conscious of the time and the fact that we're sort of wrapping up to the closing sort of comments before we go on to questions, it seems to me that throughout this conversation, actually, we've had some really positive examples of ways that things are changing and are actually very well done. And it's to a certain extent just a case of time and reaffirming those positions. Becky, I did want to just say, sort of starting with you, but bringing in others as well, following this year's publicity, it's been the sort of language that you were initially objecting to. It's sort of become fairly clear that actually that's not just a case of one publication. It's more widespread than that. And, you know, there have been examples in the press of women using those sorts of languages, those sort of language when reviewing whiskey, historically. So if we're all in agreement that sort of language is an isolated element of the bigger problem, but is unacceptable, what needs to be done to change things generally to make things more acceptable?
Yeah, that's a good question. This obviously does go further than the language used in one publication or in reviews generally. The issue that I have with any objectification of women in any kind of writing or blog or by an influencer or whatever is I feel that is that person's right to talk about whatever they want to, and that's okay. It's different when the industry supports it. That's the issue, is the industry shouldn't be supporting those writers or bloggers or vloggers or influencers, because what we should be doing is making whiskey a more inclusive space for everybody, anyone who wants to drink it. So I don't think that there's any one thing that needs to change for us to be progressive and move forward. as I said earlier, this is a industry-wide problem. It's a global problem, and it's something that the entire whiskey industry, not just the Scotch industry, but the American, the English, the Welsh, the entire world needs to work together to and through the line as well, right from advertising and marketing from the board all the way down through production, through to PR companies, distributors, the on-trade and the off-trade. It's like all hands have to work together to change the perception here that it's not just men that drink whiskey. Women make whiskey too, and we're all in this together, and that's what needs to change. And I think every individual company has its own steps and own ideas, and there are big associations that are doing great steps. The Scotch Whisky Association's diversity and inclusion policy, which is a brilliant step forward. The Kentucky Distillers Association is doing something similar as well, and there's a lot of rumblings as well behind the scenes of other things happening too. So there's a lot of progressive steps forward. Yeah, I think probably the one thing is a cohesive strategy and working together on this. That's probably the main takeaway.
Megan, what would you say? I mean, there are a lot of brands saying that they're putting things in place to try to tackle this, and particularly now we've had this sort of recent press coverage. There are a lot of brands saying, there are a lot of marketing teams saying that they don't condone sexist behaviour, but what frameworks are in place to support it? I mean, what would you say needs to happen from a production point of view as a woman working in the industry?
I think there needs to be, again, having these type of discussions, but it is trying to normalize, like Becky and Steph said. It's not to make it, like you said, to be like, it's to be the unicorns out there. So I don't know from like a marketing perspective. And I think being out there and speaking, having the women who are very intelligent, doing their job really well, and understanding the way, you know, their industry works. And I mean, you look at Milroy's down in London, and you've got somebody like Katie behind the bar or Lindsay, who used to be up at the Craigellachie. I think and Steph, obviously where you are, you have these people who are out there. The more people we get out there, and the more people who are seen out there in the industry and educating the public, then it will become more normal. And it's not going to be like people will walk into a distillery and they won't automatically assume the man is running it. You know, they will see that it does. I mean, it will become normalized. And I think we just need to, I don't think fighting about it, like we do need to just have that education and have more, I guess, the advertising. I don't watch television and I don't do a lot of reading of periodicals and that sort of thing, but you know, just making it more normal that women are doing all of these things. And not, yeah, I think it's just, it will become that way. It's changed so dramatically over the last 25 years. So I think we're working towards it, and it's just, we just need to keep talking about it and keep telling people, like, expressing to them some of these things that, you know, they're saying, like calling them out, but, you know, not in an angry sort of way.
Steph, do you have anything to add to that? I'll come to you in a second, Irene. Steph, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say that I think from the kind of perspective of the industry side of things that I'm in, is I guess approaching every situation that the person that you're talking to that sounds like they're knowledgeable probably are knowledgeable, in which case then, you know, give them their time, give them their space to have their voice. And I think that that's something that wider within the industry, that's, you know, whether that's in a tasting, you know, is shouting down, you know, not getting angry about it either, but shouting down unacceptable behaviour, not because it's biased towards women, which it might be, but it's just unacceptable behaviour. So just talk about what acceptable behaviour is. So if you are the person that's leading the tasting, you're probably there for a good reason. You've not been put there by the company or the brand because you don't know your stuff. So believe the person that's standing in front of you. And then beyond that, from a consumer point of view as well, you know, go up to the bar and ask for the whiskey and be confident about it. And if you get any kind of, you know, crap from the person behind the bar, which you shouldn't be, but if you do, then stand up for yourself, because there's a reason that you're asking for it. There's a reason that you want to drink it. It's not for a statement. You know, so just I think there just needs to be a wholesome change of attitude from every point of view, whether that's marketing, from a consumer point of view, from a brand point of view. You know, back up women, but don't back up women because they're women. Back them up because unacceptable situations happen and they are members of your team. So give them the space to have their voice and their knowledge heard.
Irene, sorry to cut you off. You wanted to add something?
No, I could see Megan's point, and I was going to say that for all these changes that we're all talking about that is needed, actually, I mean, the language only is the external expression of what is. So if for things to change, I think you need all the stakeholders to be engaged, you know, the shareholders, the workforce, the consumers. And you do need to integrate gender balance as part of purpose and brand. Once you do those things as an industry, I think that the language will fall in place, because what drives the language is key principles. But they're changing. We see evidence. And it's lovely. And you see players, if I may mention one, like Diageo, for example. I understand that, you know, they've got set goals. By 2025, they want to include 50% of women in their graduate program. You know, they already have a big percentage of women in board positions or executives. In fact, double the number that is the average in the banking industry. So there are good examples. There are leaders out there. And I think the rest will learn, and with work by people like Becky, who have a voice, who represent the industry in the press, it's going to happen. Perhaps it's not happening as fast as we would all like it to be, but it's happening. We need to finish on a positive note.
I agree. Well, actually, we're going to finish on some questions, if that's okay. I'd like to pose this question. This is actually from Ken Lindsay. Ian, I'd like to pose this to you to start with, if that's okay. Does the panel believe that sexism or gender bias in the whiskey industry is deep-seated and ingrained, or is it practiced by a minority?
I would say the latter, practiced by a minority. The company I work with is very much about inclusion, and you get the job based on your ability. It's not about getting a balance of men and women at 50-50. It's about who's the best person for the job, and they get the job. But going back to what I said earlier, if you have a strong presence in your recruiting model, that definitely does help take the right people through, regardless of their sex. It's all about ability.
If I can just add on to Ian's comment, I think it's really important to establish that a lot of the sexism or gender bias comments, remarks and behaviour that women in the industry experience don't necessarily come from their colleagues. It mostly comes from consumers. In my experience, I found the industry to be extremely supportive, and my male colleagues to be just wonderful human beings. So most of the sexism that I've experienced has been from consumers, and that all stems from that perception that whiskey is a boys' club, that it's a man's drink.
So linked to that question, actually, there's a second question here from Kelly Johnson. What sort of practical steps can be put into place within the industry going forward with regards to eradicating the old boys' club mentality? Becky, what do you reckon on that one?
I think we probably answered that through our conversations already about how we can move forward. I think it's within the whiskey industry itself, it's making sure that women feel women have access they're able to apply for leadership positions, that there are opportunities for women within the industry, and they feel comfortable and confident to work in their jobs, regardless of whether that's within a production role, marketing, or even if that's behind the bar or in a whiskey shop. I've had so many messages from women who've worked in shops and behind bars who've quit the industry altogether because of the experience that they've had. So I think having a better representation of women, the industry has to work towards generating greater respect for women within those jobs, for the industry as a whole, colleagues to call out any remarks when they see it in a kind way. I mean, there's a way of doing it, of taking somebody to one side and saying, do you know what, you probably shouldn't say that. There's a way of doing it, but calling it out, and it's an education job, as Irene said, of just teaching people that, you know, the industry has moved on since the 1970s. And then again, it's down to the marketing as well. If you're constantly only ever featuring men in your marketing, then whiskey will only ever become known as an old boy's drink.
I have another question here, which I'd like to ask Steph to start with. It's from an anonymous attendee. Is the same degree of sexism or bias experienced across the generations, or are younger male people more open-minded?
I mean, I think I talked before, kind of leading up to this, I talked to a couple of, you know, women that work in the industry of various generations. And I think that the experience is probably more, I think what Becky was saying was right, is that generally within the context of the industry and your colleagues, women are generally very well supported. And I think that is cross-generational, but I think that what helps from a younger perspective is that generally in the wider context of society, things are changing. So I think that probably younger men, I think probably feeding into what Irene was saying, is that they have a different kind of understanding and conceptualization of what equality means. Possibly from an older generation, they would have been feeding into the culture that they had been living in or brought up in, and that kind of feeds into that side of things. So from I think it's more positive now than what it might have been. I think also generationally, obviously, there are more women working nowadays in the industry, whereas before there were fewer and far between. So you were seen as more of that kind of unicorn position, because there were not that many of you, so you had to you were the different person in the room. So I think it's probably better nowadays than it has been in the past, which is a move in the right direction.
And final question, which I'd actually like to pose to Megan, if that's all right. The question is, how have you dealt with direct sexism whilst working? But actually, I'd like to extend that slightly to say, what advice would you give for women coming into the industry now, in the hope that we can end in a positive, action-based perspective?
I've had a number of situations. I mean, I started out in this industry quite a long time ago, and at that point, I was quiet and shy, and I found going to whiskey tasting super intimidating. And over the years, I just started to build myself up, build up my education, and I would begin to sort of push ahead at those lineups. And, you know, men that were sort of dismissing me or talking over me, I would, you know, I had to puff myself up. I'm only 5'4", but I would get up there, and then, you know, I would be able to say my piece, and people saw that I knew what I was talking about. I recently actually went as a consumer to an event, and I went up to the bar, and there were a few men there speaking with this particular brand ambassador, and he was serving them, which was fine. So I waited my turn. Another man walked up to the bar, and he greeted that man and started talking to that man. And I stepped up and I was like, oh, hey, hi. Oh, you probably didn't see me because I'm short and a woman, but I was wondering if I could try that dram. So he proceeded to pour that and went back to talking to his friends. Then another woman came up to the bar, slightly shorter than me. And again, I watched. I didn't want to strike in, and he continued to do what he did, and he did the exact same thing to her. So I once again piped up, oh, hi. Oh, you probably didn't see her because she's even shorter than me, but she would like a dram if you wouldn't mind. So, and this is very recent and very, it was with, yeah, sorry, I've just had something pop up on my screen here. But I think it is, you have to be a little bit forceful and in their face. And I think by saying that, and it wasn't, you know, hugely facetious, but it was pointing out that he spent the entire time talking to these men and didn't notice that 2 women had walked up. So I think that's, I mean, it brings these things, I think, to light for people. Maybe he didn't notice that he was doing that, but he definitely had that behavior. So I think doing this and talking to people and expressing and like Steph said, I mean, I have called out people, even at the Craigellachie, because I watched, there's young Angus and Lindsay who were working there, and a man walked up to the bar and Lindsay said, oh, can I help you? And he was like, oh, no, I'm gonna wait for him because I want a whiskey. And I said to the man, I said, you do realize that Lindsay taught Angus everything he knows? And then he was like, oh, okay. So it is expressing that kind of things. I think that helps because it makes people realize that their behavior is not exactly correct.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. And I've run out of whiskey. So I'm going to have to call it a night there. But I'd like to thank everyone that's taken part in this. Irene, Ian, Megan, Stephanie, and also Becky. It's been a fantastic conversation. I could have chatted for hours on this. We will be sharing a link to this video on YouTube in a couple of days' time. There are also a number of other further events that the Just Festival platform is launching over the coming months. So keep an eye out on social media and so on, and sign up for email for notification. But for tonight, thank you very much, everyone, for contributing and a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.
Cheers, girls. Well done. Keep up the good work.
Cheers.
Cheers all.